What would you do if you witnessed a man of God mock the Mother of God, only to be silenced by a force beyond understanding? On a crisp October morning, a pastor declared his disdain for the Virgin Mary from his own pulpit. The words, sharp and brittle, echoed against the vaulted ceilings of the cathedral, hanging in the air long after he had finished. Below him, the scent of old incense and melting beeswax mingled with the cold silence of a stunned congregation. His name was Father Michael Kavanaugh, and for 20 years he had been a pastor. His world was one of balanced budgets, diocesan memos, and the meticulous scheduling of sacraments. He was the shepherd of St. Joseph Cathedral in Buffalo, New York, a magnificent Gothic revival structure of Medina sandstone that stood as a testament to a faith he managed more than felt. His rectory office, just across a small manicured lawn from the cathedral, reflected the state of his soul. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of light slanting through the tall, grimy windows, illuminating stacks of paperwork and theological texts with unbroken spines. A large mahogany crucifix on the wall hung just slightly askew, a detail he noticed every day and never bothered to correct. The air in the room was stale, heavy with the scent of aging paper and cold coffee. Father Kavanaugh sat at his desk, his shoulders hunched, the black of his cassock lost in the shadows of the large, imposing furniture. He wasn't praying. He was highlighting line items on a spreadsheet for the parish finance council. His movements were precise, economical, the movements of a man who believed grace could be audited and salvation could be itemized. He saw the church not as a mystical body, but as an institution, a beautiful and ancient one, but an institution nonetheless. It had assets to be protected and liabilities to be managed. He paused, his pen hovering over a figure for landscaping costs, and his eyes drifted to the window. He could see the side chapel entrance, where a small, unassuming marble statue of the Virgin Mary stood half hidden by an overgrown yew bush. He felt a familiar tightening in his jaw. To him, such devotions were a liability, a relic of sentimental, uneducated faith that distracted from the logical architecture of doctrine. They were untidy, emotional, and worst of all, inefficient. His faith was a fortress of the mind, built with canon law and syllogism, and there was no room in its clean, orderly corridors for a weeping mother. His own mother had been a woman of such faith. Her name was also Mary, a coincidence that had grated on him his entire adult life. He remembered her, not in a warm, sunlit kitchen, but in a bleached white room at Mercy Hospital of Buffalo, her rosary beads clicking softly through her paper-thin fingers. Her faith had been simple, absolute, and in his eyes, utterly useless. He recalled the sterile, antiseptic smell of the cardiac wing, the relentless rhythmic beep of the machines that measured the slow, steady decline of her life. He had prayed then, a desperate bargaining prayer of a boy hiding in a priest's collar, but the heavens had remained silent. The crucifix on her wall was plastic, the corpus a cheap, factory-molded figure. She had clutched it with the same devotion she gave her rosary, her eyes fixed on it as if it held the answer to her pain. He saw no answers there, only a symbol of suffering without resolution. He remembered sitting by her bed, the city lights of South Buffalo twinkling beyond the window, while she whispered prayers to a woman in a blue mantle. He had wanted to scream at her, to tell her that her faith was a beautiful lie, a comfort that did nothing to stop the creeping paralysis in her limbs. When she died, the rosary was still tangled in her fingers. He had been the one to unlace them, the smooth, cold beads of final bitter memory. In that moment, his grief curdled into a hard, cold anger. He directed it not at God the Father, an abstract theological concept he could still respect, but at the mother. He resented her serene plaster smile, her outstretched hands that had offered his own mother nothing. He packed away the rosary in a box he never opened, and in its place he cultivated a faith of logic and law, a faith that could not be disappointed because it asked for nothing. That Sunday morning, the catalyst arrived during the 10 o'clock Mass. The cathedral was nearly full, sunlight filtering through the towering, stained-glass windows, painting the stone floors in strokes of sapphire and ruby. The air was cool, the organ's final notes still vibrating in the pews. Father Kavanaugh ascended the pulpit to deliver his homily. He began by speaking of the gospel reading, his voice clear and resonant, filling the sacred space. But then, something shifted. His eyes flickered toward the Marian altar, where the small marble statue stood, a spray of white lilies at its feet. A tightness coiled in his chest, the old anger rising like bile. He departed from his prepared notes. "We must be careful," he began, his tone hardening. "Not to let our faith degrade into mere superstition. We are a people of the word, not of folkloric sentimentality." A nervous rustle passed through the pews. He gestured dismissively toward the statue. This romanticized image of a peasant girl, elevated to a goddess by centuries of maudlin devotion, it is a distraction. Our faith rests on the firm foundation of Christ, not on the shifting sands of apparition and private revelation. He saw an elderly woman in the front row, Lucia Moretti, clutch the rosary in her hand, her knuckles white. The sight fueled his momentum. We are not children who need a fairy tale mother in the sky. We are adults. We need theology, not mythology. A gasp was audible from the pews. Mrs. Moretti's wooden rosary slipped from her grasp, clattering onto the marble floor with a sound that seemed to crack the silence. The collective breath of the congregation was held, a heavy, unified stillness. Father Kavanaugh's words had struck them not as theology, but as a violence. He finished his sermon, his voice strained, and proceeded with the liturgy, but the air in the cathedral had grown cold and heavy. At 7:14 p.m. that evening, he was back in his office, the door shut against the world. He was on the telephone with a Monsignor from the diocesan chancery, arguing about the soaring cost of insurance for the cathedral's historic art. "The premiums are indefensible," he was saying, his voice sharp with irritation. "We are a house of God, not a museum." He stopped. His left arm went numb, a pins and needles sensation that shot straight into his chest. A crushing weight, immense and absolute, descended upon him, stealing his breath. The receiver slipped from his hand, clattering against the mahogany desk before falling to the thick Persian rug with a dull thud. He tried to call out, but his throat seized. As he slid from his chair, the last thing his housekeeper, Mrs. Rossi, heard through the thick oak door was a single ragged whisper. "Mary!" The paramedics worked quickly, their movements efficient and practiced under the dim light of the rectory office. They moved around Father Kavanaugh's still form, the familiar lexicon of their profession cutting through the stunned silence. Mrs. Rossi stood in the doorway, her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide. The news spread through the parish with the speed of a lit fuse. It traveled through phone calls, then text messages, a quiet cascade of shock and fear. The next morning, small, hushed groups gathered on the steps of St. Joseph Cathedral, their faces etched with concern and a kind of awe. They spoke in low tones, glancing at the doors of the rectory as if expecting an answer to emerge. At Sophia's restaurant, a few miles away on Military Road in Buffalo, the regulars in the corner booth talked of nothing else. A retired firefighter stirred his coffee, his spoon clinking against the ceramic mug. "They say his heart just stopped." Mid-sentence, a woman who worked as a teller at the bank across the street shook her head. "After what he said at Mass, it's a sign." No one used words like punishment or wrath. They spoke with a quiet, solemn gravity, as if they had collectively witnessed a veil being pulled back, revealing a mystery they were not equipped to understand. The incident was not a piece of gossip. It was a weight that had settled over their community, pressing them into silence. Father Kavanaugh lay in a room on the 3rd floor of Mercy Hospital of Buffalo, the same hospital where his mother had died. The steady, rhythmic beep of the heart monitor was a sound he knew too well. The fluorescent lights on the ceiling hummed with a flat, sterile indifference, casting no shadows. He felt a profound, aching weakness, a hollowness that seemed to emanate from the very center of his bones. A thick, oppressive weight rested on his chest, a physical manifestation of the silence that had answered him from the pulpit. He was isolated in a world of bleached white sheets and the faint, pervasive smell of antiseptic. The diocesan vicar had visited a tall, thin man whose expression of concern did not quite reach his eyes. His words were carefully chosen, platitudes about rest and recovery that felt like thin blankets laid over a chasm. When he left, the silence in the room returned, deeper than before. A low-grade fever burned behind Kavanaugh's eyes, and a fine tremor lived in his hands, making it difficult to lift the plastic cup of water on his bedside table. He stared at the crucifix on the wall, a simple wooden one, and for the first time he saw not an object of theological principle, but an image of profound suffering. The room, with its sealed windows and recycled air, felt less like a place of healing and more like a tomb. Late one night, near the 3:00 a.m. hour that is neither night nor morning, the world in his room went still. The incessant hum of the hospital faded into a deep, velvety silence. The rhythmic beep of the heart monitor, his only companion, did not stop, but its sharp electronic edge seemed to soften, to blend into the quiet. Then a scent, faint at first, then unmistakable, began to fill the air. It was the fragrance of roses, fresh and dewy, a smell so rich and real it completely overpowered the sterile scent of disinfectant. Kavanaugh's eyes, heavy with fever, struggled to open. In the corner of the room where the wall met the window, a light began to pool. It was not the harsh glare of a fluorescent bulb or the yellow of a lamp. It was a soft, gentle luminescence, the color of a pale blue sky at dawn, and it radiated a profound and unconditional peace. It did not push back the shadows. It seemed to absorb them. There was no figure, no voice, just the light, the scent, and the silence. As the blue-white glow intensified, bathing the room in its calm radiance, the crushing weight on his chest began to lift. The feverish heat behind his eyes cooled. The erratic tremor in his hands ceased. Down the hall, a night nurse making her rounds paused, her hand on a chart. She cocked her head, certain she had heard the distant, melodic tolling of a single church bell. She checked her watch, saw the hour, and dismissed it, a trick of a tired mind. 3 weeks later, Father Kavanaugh walked out of the main entrance of Mercy Hospital. He was thinner, his movements slower, but his eyes held a clarity that had not been there before. He did not return to the rectory. Instead, he directed the taxi to St. Joseph Cathedral. He entered not through the grand front doors, but through the small, unassuming side entrance that led to the Marian chapel. The statue stood as it always had, serene and silent in the cool, dim light. Dust had gathered on the folds of its marble robes and at the base, where Mrs. Moretti's broken rosary still lay. He did not pray, not with words. His prayer was an action. From the inside pocket of his coat, he removed a simple, clean white cloth. He knelt, the unforgiving stone floor pressing into his knees, and he began to clean the statue. He wiped away the dust from the serene face, from the outstretched hands, from the intricately carved folds of the blue mantle. His movements were tender, meticulous, an act of reverence and contrition. He then gently picked up the pieces of the broken rosary and placed them in his pocket. Finally, he took a single, perfect white rose he had carried with him and laid it at the statue's feet. The quiet act of a priest cleaning a statue did not go unnoticed. A young woman, sitting in a back pew and wrestling with a decision that had kept her awake for nights, watched him. She saw the careful way he polished the marble, the gentle way he placed the rose. The next day, she walked into a Catholic Charities office on Elmwood Avenue and signed up to volunteer at the food pantry. A few days later, an old parishioner who had been scandalized by the sermon returned to the cathedral. He saw the clean statue and the fresh rose at its feet, and instead of leaving, he found a toolbox and quietly repaired a squeaking hinge on the chapel door. The ripples spread. One of the paramedics who had treated Father Kavanaugh, a man who hadn't set foot in a church in a decade, found himself parked outside the cathedral on his day off. He went inside and simply sat in the silence for 20 minutes, feeling a peace he couldn't name. Mrs. Rossi, the housekeeper, began a new ritual. Every morning she replaced the rose at the statue's base, creating a small, constant bloom of renewal in the quiet corner of the church. The hardness in the community, the fear and judgment that had followed the incident, began to soften, replaced by small, anonymous acts of service and care. Father Kavanaugh's ministry was transformed. His homilies were no longer theological lectures. They were quiet, humble reflections on mercy and second chances, often lasting no more than 5 minutes. He spent less time in his office and more time in the pews, listening. He was often found in the Marian chapel, not preaching, but simply being present, a quiet figure of solace for those who came seeking it. A story began to circulate through the parish, a piece of the new legacy he was building. A young, frantic mother, her son newly diagnosed with a severe illness, had found the priest by the statue. She expected counsel or platitudes. Instead, Father Kavanaugh simply knelt beside her on the cold stone floor, took out the repaired rosary of Lucia Moretti, and prayed with her until her tears subsided and a quiet calm settled in her heart. He had learned that faith was not in the argument, but in the shared silence, in the kneeling. The story of the priest who mocked the Virgin Mary and was silenced is now a quiet legend at St. Joseph Cathedral in Buffalo. It is not a tale of fire and brimstone, but of a profound and startling mercy. It lives on, not in plaques or sermons, but in the single fresh rose that appears at the feet of the statue every morning. It serves as a reminder that the proudest heart can be broken open, and that grace often enters through the wound. It teaches that the most powerful prayers are not always spoken, but are sometimes found in the humble act of wiping something clean, of mending what is broken, and of simply kneeling in the quiet presence of love. If this story touched you, like the video. Subscribe to and share it with someone who needs hope today. Tell us your moment of unexpected grace in the comments.